Russia didn't move tanks. It didn't issue an ultimatum. It didn't announce an invasion. Instead, it pulled a lever it has used for decades: energy, timing, pressure, and in Moldova, that lever was supposed to work the way it always had. But this time, something broke. Because when Moscow squeezed, Moldova didn't collapse. The lights stayed on. The government didn't fall, and panic didn't spread fast enough. That delay is the story, and the reason for it sits just across the border. Romania. This video isn't about Romania threatening Russia. It isn't about troops or missiles. It's about something far more dangerous to Moscow. Romania is quietly making Russia's pressure tactics unreliable in Moldova. And once pressure stops working on small states, Russia's entire regional playbook starts to fail. If you want clear, no-hype breakdowns of how power actually moves in Europe, subscribe now. We get straight to the point. Now here's where the problem really begins for Moscow. For most of its modern history, Moldova was never meant to resist Russia. It was meant to bend. Moldova is small. It has limited military capacity. It sits outside NATO, and for years it depended heavily on Russian energy to keep its economy running. From Moscow's perspective, this made Moldova ideal. You didn't need to invade it. You didn't need to occupy it. You just needed to apply pressure and wait. Gas prices rise, electricity becomes uncertain. Winter approaches, political tension spikes, protests follow. Governments wobble. Russia has used this exact formula across Eastern Europe. And in Moldova, it worked repeatedly. The key wasn't force, it was timing. Russia's pressure strategy relies on creating a short, sharp window where decisions must be made before help arrives. Before Europe coordinates, before reforms settle, before outside support can stabilize the situation. That window is everything. And for years, Moldova lived inside it. Energy dependence gave Russia leverage not just over infrastructure but over politics. Every winter became a test. Every price increase became a warning. Every disruption reminded Moldovan leaders how exposed they were. This is why Moldova mattered strategically, not because it was powerful, but because it was vulnerable. And then there is Transnistria, a frozen conflict, a Russian military presence, a lever that could be pulled whenever pressure was needed. Transnistria allowed Russia to maintain influence without responsibility. It was a reminder that escalation was always an option, even if it never happened. For Moscow, this setup was efficient, low cost, low risk, high leverage. Until it wasn't. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly, during a moment when Russia expected Moldova to crack under familiar pressure. Energy flows were disrupted, prices spiked. Transnistria felt the shock immediately. But mainland Moldova didn't collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. Power came from the west. Gas came through alternative routes. Emergency support arrived faster than Russia's timeline allowed. And at the center of that shift was Romania. Romania didn't replace Russia as a dominant power. It did something far more destabilizing to Moscow's strategy. It absorbed the shock. Romania shares more than a border with Moldova. It shares language. It shares infrastructure. It shares deep historical and cultural ties. But more importantly, Romania sits inside the European Union and NATO. That changes everything. Energy assistance no longer has to cross half a continent. Diplomatic coordination no longer takes weeks. Support doesn't arrive after the crisis peaks. It arrives while the pressure is still building. This is the part Russia did not plan for. Moscow's pressure model assumes delay. It assumes fragmentation. It assumes that small states panic before help becomes real. Romania removes that delay, not loudly, not provocatively, but consistently. And that consistency is lethal to Russia's strategy. Because pressure only works when it creates urgency. When urgency disappears, leverage fades. Russia can still squeeze. But the squeeze no longer produces immediate results. The panic window shrinks. The political shock dulls. And suddenly, Moscow is applying pressure without momentum. That is dangerous. Because when pressure doesn't escalate fast enough, it backfires. Costs rise, control weakens, and the target state gains time to adapt. This is exactly what is happening in Moldova. Romania is not confronting Russia directly. It is doing something far more effective. It is breaking Russia's timing. And once timing breaks, the entire strategy starts to unravel. In the next part, we'll look at why Romania's role doesn't just stabilize Moldova. It turns one of Russia's strongest tools, Transnistria, into a growing liability. And that is where Moscow's problem gets much bigger. For years, Transnistria was Russia's insurance policy in Moldova. It was the quiet threat in the background. The reminder that escalation was always possible. The pressure point that didn't need to be used to be effective. A small strip of land east of the Dniester River, frozen in time, hosting Russian troops, Soviet-era depots, and a political status that never quite resolved itself. From Moscow's perspective, Transnistria served three purposes at once. It constrained Moldova's foreign policy. It discouraged deep Western integration. And it provided a ready-made excuse for intervention if pressure elsewhere failed. As long as Moldova depended on Russian energy, Transnistria didn't need to move. Its value came from being there. But that value depended on one assumption: that Moldova would always remain isolated and fragile. That assumption is breaking. The moment Romania began absorbing Moldova's shocks, Transnistria stopped functioning as leverage and started functioning as a liability. And once you understand why that lever stopped working, you'll see why Russia's entire Moldova strategy is quietly collapsing. Here's why. Transnistria is not economically self-sufficient. It relies heavily on energy inputs, trade routes, and financial arrangements that pass through Moldova and the broader European space. For years, Russia offset those weaknesses through subsidies, discounted gas, and political shielding. But when energy flows became unstable, Transnistria felt it immediately. Factories slowed. Electricity shortages emerged. Local authorities faced pressures they were not designed to manage independently. This is the uncomfortable truth for Moscow. Transnistria works only when Russia can control the surrounding environment. Once that environment stabilizes without Russia, the enclave becomes exposed. Romania's role changes that environment. When Moldova is no longer on the brink of collapse, Transnistria loses its strategic urgency. There is no panic to exploit, no crisis to escalate, no justification for sudden moves, and worse, the costs of maintaining Transnistria start to rise. Russian troops stationed there are isolated. Supply routes are constrained. Any overt reinforcement would immediately trigger regional attention. What was once a low-cost pressure tool becomes a long-term burden. This flips the logic Moscow relied on. Instead of Transnistria anchoring Russian influence inside Moldova, Moldova's stabilization increasingly isolates Transnistria from its surroundings. That isolation matters politically. The Moldovan government no longer has to make desperate concessions to avoid escalation. It can afford to wait. It can afford to negotiate slowly. It can afford to refuse ultimatums. Time, once Russia's advantage, starts working against it. There is also a military dimension Russia cannot ignore. Transnistria is geographically vulnerable, it is narrow, it is boxed in. It has no strategic depth. As long as Moldova was weak, that vulnerability didn't matter. No one wanted to test it. But stabilization changes calculations. Not because Moldova is preparing to retake Transnistria by force, but because the cost of miscalculation rises for Russia. Any sudden move involving Transnistria now risks wider consequences, regional scrutiny, European involvement, NATO attention across the border. Russia does not fear Moldova, it fears entanglement. This is where Romania's role becomes decisive without ever being dramatic. By ensuring Moldova does not collapse under pressure, Romania removes the scenarios where Russia benefits from escalation. No chaos, no vacuum, no invitation. Transnistria becomes a problem Russia has to manage rather than a tool it can exploit. And this is a fundamental shift. Frozen conflicts are only useful when the surrounding state is unstable. Once stability sets in, the freeze stops serving Moscow's interests. This is why Russia's posture around Moldova has grown more cautious rather than more aggressive. Not because Moscow has lost interest, but because its favorite lever no longer moves the system the way it used to. Pressure without payoff is wasted effort. Escalation without urgency is dangerous. And maintaining control without momentum is expensive. Romania did not neutralize Transnistria by force. It neutralized it by making it strategically awkward. And that leads directly to the next layer of the problem. Because Romania is not acting alone, it is acting as part of something much larger. And once Moldova is pulled into that wider system, Russia's room to maneuver shrinks even further. Part 3. Romania is turning Moldova into a system, not a frontline. Russia has always been comfortable pressuring weak states. It knows how to do that. It has done it for decades. You apply energy pressure, you stir political instability, you lean on frozen conflicts, you wait for the system to crack. What Romania is doing to Moldova breaks that playbook entirely, because Romania is not treating Moldova like a frontline. It is treating it like infrastructure. And that difference matters more than any single military move. For most of its post-Soviet history, Moldova existed in a permanent gray zone, not fully aligned with Russia, not fully integrated with Europe, politically fragile, economically vulnerable, and constantly exposed to pressure from multiple directions. That gray zone was Russia's advantage. Because gray zones are where escalation works best, they are slow to react, divided internally, and unsure who will step in if things go wrong. Romania's strategy is to eliminate the gray zone entirely, not by annexation, not by military guarantees, but by quietly plugging Moldova into systems that already work: energy, infrastructure, finance, institutions, security cooperation. This is the shift Moscow did not plan for. Once Moldova starts functioning as part of a wider European system, pressure stops producing leverage. It starts producing resistance. And systems don't collapse the way frontlines do. They resist pressure by design. Take energy first, because that was Russia's strongest lever for years. Moldova depended heavily on Russian gas. That dependence gave Moscow the ability to apply pressure without firing a shot. Price hikes, supply uncertainty, seasonal threats, political signaling through pipelines. Romania moved to cut that dependency at the structural level, by expanding interconnectors, by supplying electricity, by backing diversification with EU support, by absorbing shocks when Russia tried to squeeze. That does not make Moldova energy independent overnight, but it changes the risk calculus. Energy pressure no longer collapses the system, it gets managed. And once pressure is manageable, it stops being decisive. The same logic applies to economics. Romania has become one of Moldova's most important trade partners. Romanian banks operate inside Moldova. Romanian companies invest in logistics, retail, and services. Romanian labor markets absorb Moldovan workers. This creates something Russia struggles to counter: redundancy. When one channel is pressured, another compensates. When one sector slows, another keeps moving. Russia's influence model depends on single points of failure. Romania is deliberately removing them. Then there is the institutional layer. Romania does not speak to Moldova as a patron, it speaks as a template. Legal alignment, administrative reform, border management, customs integration, anti-corruption frameworks. These are not dramatic changes, they do not trend on social media. But they are irreversible once embedded. Every reform reduces the space where Russian influence traditionally operates. Opaque systems, informal power, personal leverage over institutions. As Moldova becomes more rule-bound, Russian pressure loses traction. You cannot coerce what no longer responds to backroom pressure. There is also a security dimension, and this is where Moscow becomes particularly uncomfortable. Romania is a NATO member, Moldova is not. But cooperation does not require membership. Training, border security, intelligence sharing, crisis coordination. None of this violates Moldova's constitutional neutrality, but all of it raises the cost of interference. Russia does not see Romanian cooperation in isolation. It sees the shadow behind it. Once Moldova operates in coordination with Romania, any destabilization attempt risks touching NATO and the EU indirectly, not automatically, not militarily, but politically and strategically. That is enough to slow Moscow down. Because Russia's preferred pressure campaigns rely on ambiguity, on plausible deniability, on uncertainty about who will respond. Romania reduces ambiguity. It shortens response chains. It makes escalation visible earlier, and visibility kills leverage. Here is the deeper problem for Russia. Moldova is no longer being treated as a prize. It is being treated as a process. There's no single moment to disrupt, no decisive election to hijack, no singular dependency to exploit. Pressure does not collapse the system, it tests it, and the system holds. That changes how Moscow has to think. Instead of asking, how do we push Moldova? The question becomes, how much? Does pushing Moldova now cost us? And the answer keeps rising. Romania's approach is not confrontational. It does not threaten Russia. It does not challenge it directly. It simply removes the conditions that made Russian pressure effective. And when pressure no longer produces results, escalation becomes risky, because escalation without leverage is just exposure. This is why Romania is becoming Russia's biggest obstacle in Moldova. Not because it is loud, not because it is aggressive, but because it is methodical. It is turning Moldova from a vulnerable state into a functioning system, and systems are very hard to coerce.